Welcome to the Ideas on Stage podcast, your regular insight into leadership communication.
Hello, Andrea Pacini here from Ideas on Stage. I'm here today with Dr. Jonathan Downie, who is a consultant conference interpreter. He works between French and English. He's also an author of 2 books, and he's also an interpreting researcher, and that's what we're going to talk about today, interpreting. And today's conversation will be mainly relevant for international speakers, so those who have an opportunity to speak in public to an audience who don't necessarily speak their own language. But also, let's see, Jonathan, if we have some time, I would also like to ask you some questions which would be relevant for international event organizers, because I know that you have experienced that, but let's see. Let's see how much time we have. So for now, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
It's good to be here, and it's good to be able to have this kind of conversation, because sadly in some events interpreters and speakers are kind of locked off from each other. And one of the things that I try to get speakers to remember is that the interpreter who's interpreting you is another speaker. So it's that level of partnership. I've got a video that I'm editing together at the moment where the first tip that I give speakers is treat your interpreter as if you were doing the speech with them as another speaker. And that covers so much ground.
Yeah, let's start with this point, because I heard you say that an interpreter should be treated as a speaker. And actually, before that, because then just for those who are not entirely familiar with this area, would you like to explain a little bit about what you do? What does an interpreter does in this context?
Okay. So an interpreter has what sounds like the very simple role of taking what the speaker says in one language and turning it into something as persuasive, as powerful, as impactful in another. So we're not just talking about, okay, the speaker said dog, what's the French for dog? That's the stuff of dictionaries, and as anyone who's experienced kind of word for word interpreting will tell you, it doesn't really work. So instead, we tend to be a few seconds behind the speaker, and a professional interpreter is trained to go idea by idea rather than word by word. And so you can get an interpreter on stage with the speaker. They could be waiting for the speaker to finish and then kind of doing what we call a consecutive rendition of the entire speech after the speaker's finished the whole thing. Or the last option, which is actually the most common, is they could be working simultaneously, which means that usually in a soundproof booth at the back of the room, working a few seconds behind the speaker and trying to both project the meaning of what the speaker is saying, the intention behind it, the persuasiveness, the artfulness, to an audience who have a completely different background to the original speaker.
And is that why then you say that an interpreter should be treated as a public speaker?
Yes. There was a hypothesis that I came up with in my PhD, which is what I call the single performance hypothesis, which is that in many cases, the audience take what they hear from the interpreter and what they see from the speaker and shove them together to be one thing. So if you get an interpreter who's incredibly accurate but very bad at delivery, then everyone thinks then everyone realizes this is a bad experience. The interpreter almost has a harder job than the speaker, because if the speaker wants to go off on a tangent, they can, and it's not a problem and no one will ever know. I'm a professional speaker myself, and so I know that I can go off my notes and no one cares. The interpreter can't wander off what the speaker's saying. So they're following the speaker along, but still trying to be as good as the speaker was, if not in some cases slightly better.
And you mentioned bad experience. Now, I had an experience, not my own, but I organize a lot of events and workshops in London. And by the way, you are not based in London, you are in Scotland, right?
Yeah, I'm based in Edinburgh, but I'm 10 minutes from the airport, so I'm based wherever an aeroplane can take me.
Lovely city. I love Edinburgh. I'm coming to Scotland again in, I think it's April, just for a few days. I'm going to the islands finally.
The islands in Scotland are superb. And one thing I like about Scotland is that wherever you come from, you're made to feel welcome. And so, the university that I did my interpreter training at is just outside of Edinburgh, and you would walk down certain corridors and hear 6 or 7 languages from one end of the corridor to the other. And that's the environment I'm used to being in.
That's where you come from. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so bad experience. Yeah, I was running one of my own workshops in London, and there was one of the participants, a professional, I wouldn't say professional public speaker, but a public speaker. And he told me, look, I had a bad experience. I was speaking in China, and I had an interpreter with me because I don't speak Chinese. But I could see, he said, that I wasn't able to make a real connection with the audience. And he said, this was one of my typical speeches that I always give, and normally works very well. But in that situation, I could see that it wasn't working. And he asked me, do you have any tips for me? And I said, no, I don't know. And that's why I wanted to have a conversation with you. So what was going on there, and what would you tell him?
So there's a few things that I would tell them. The first thing is that your interpreter is another speaker, but they're also your first audience. So we have this dual role of being the first audience and the second speaker. And so that means that if you're going to connect with anyone, you have to connect with your interpreter. If your interpreter can understand not just what you're saying, but what you're trying to do, their job becomes almost impossible, and they revert to, well, I'll just say what he said. It's the lowest risk strategy. It's usually the least successful as well. And so, but if your interpreter understands, okay, he's making a joke because he's trying to do this, a professional interpreter will get it. So things like briefing the interpreter at least 2 weeks before on what you're going to say. We like to have your PowerPoint slides, but primarily what we need is, what are you going to say? Who are you saying it to? Why are you saying it? If we know those 3 things and we know the results you're trying to get, that's much more use to us than a PowerPoint slide full of charts.
Okay.
The other thing that I would say is that what works for one audience doesn't work for another. So I know there are certain things. I did a webinar recently for Scottish Enterprise on international business and translation and interpreting. And I realized that there were things that I could get away with when I'm doing a webinar to my fellow interpreters that I can't get away with when I'm doing one for Scottish Enterprise. There are certain audiences that I deliberately play the fool and do silly things on stage when I'm speaking to, and others where I'm in suit and tie and I'm a lot stiller. And this is where, if you're working with a good interpreter, they will at least be able to give you generic ideas of what will and won't work. Every interpreter that I know has had occasions where they felt like they're swimming out to save a speaker who's made a mistake.
And you mentioned that there are certain things and perhaps even certain messages maybe that work well for a certain audience, and other things that don't work as well for other audiences. Now, in your own experience, how do you go about understanding your audience before the actual presentation?
So this is kind of generic speaking skills. The first thing that I've had to learn the hard way is that great speakers listen before they speak. And so if, for instance, if you have an audience that speaks the same language as you, you really should be trying to hang around the forums they're on, following their key decision makers and listening to the kind of language that they're using. If they speak a different language to you, this is another area where you really need to be leaning on your interpreters. And if there's several languages, leaning on your consultant and saying, what do I need to know before I stand up? Maybe your event manager might know, maybe your consultant interpreter might know. Those are 2 key contacts.
So, sorry, Jonathan, to cut you off, because I think the connection was slightly lost. So you asked the question and you said, what do I need to know? And then
before I speak.
Okay.
So I've got an invite to speak sitting in my inbox at the moment, and rather than responding straight away with yes, I responded back and said it would be an honor. And then I said, what is it that you need me to say at your event? Because sometimes a speaker comes in and they've got a prepared speech and they say, I'm going to deliver this. That might not be what that audience needs. It may be that they need your message, but you need to change the packaging. And this is where working with your event manager or your consultant interpreter, preferably both, will help you work out how to make this work.
Yeah. And And absolutely, this is super important also in my own experience. And I'm just curious. And if you don't have, if this question doesn't lead anywhere, we can change it, no problem at all. But by any chance, do you have maybe a set of questions that you ask a conference organizer when they ask you to speak for them? Do you use anything in particular for you to understand as much as possible about your audience?
I'm still working on that, to be honest. I use the John C. Maxwell approach, which is to ask the question, what do you need me to say? And is there anything that you can't say that you would like me to say?
Mm.
Because every organization has taboos, every organization has difficult topics. And if you're an outside speaker, you have the wonderful advantage that whatever you say, you're going to leave the next day. And so while I have a standard brief for anyone who's working with interpreters, which I ask people to fill in everything on the page, I have a standard brief for that. I'll need to work on a standard brief for speaking. But at the moment, whenever I'm asked to speak, I try to think, what are they asking me to say? What do they need me to say? And what can't they say that they want me to?
That's a great question. I like it.
And
Okay.
it's different. If you're kind of just, if I'm speaking as one of 20 speakers in a conference, that's different. But if I'm a keynote or if I'm a main speaker, or if I'm doing an in-person course, I'll often say, what do you need me to say that you can't? And this is one sitting in my inbox at the moment where I know that organization well enough that I know there will be some things that they cannot possibly say right now, and they need an outsider to come in and just say it and go home.
Interesting. Okay. Now, let's go back a little bit to interpreting. Now, can I ask a cheeky question?
Of course. I'm used to cheeky questions. I usually ask them myself.
The question is, look, we live in a world of automation, artificial intelligence, technology. Why in 2020 do we need people to do that?
So there's two things going on there. There's first is we live in a world of automation and technology, but we also live in a world of people. And as long as we live in a world of people, the technology will always be chasing to catch up because people are more complex than technology. The more fundamental thing is that the biggest mistake that people make is they think that knowing the words means understanding. And that's not the same thing. So without going too deeply into the woods of my second book, which is on automatic speech translation, the algorithms behind that basically just give you what each sentence means, or a version of what each sentence means. They have no sense of context. They have no sense of politeness. They have no sense of art. They have no sense of crafting. So imagine someone having spent, days crafting the perfect speech, and then they give it to a machine that goes, well, that. It doesn't make any sense. If they're going to spend time crafting the speech, it makes sense to entrust that speech to people who in turn have spent days preparing to craft that speech again. So roughly for every 1 day of work, an interpreter will do one day of preparation on average. Sometimes it's a lot more. And so then you're going from craftsperson to craftsperson rather than from craftsperson to factory. And so I say to people, speech translation has a lot of good uses. If you're needing to book into a hotel, or if you're needing to get some tech support, or if you're needing to find a toilet, or say I've got a sore throat, then speech translation is great because then all you need is the words. The moment you need something more than the words, you need the performance, you need the persuasion, you need the connection, you need another human being.
Great answer. I love this answer. And yeah, this is not that connection is not something that at least today a robot is able to do. Maybe never.
Well, it's the difference between a lot of companies are going on to chatbots whenever you interact with them. And I don't know about you, but I can tell a chatbot miles away, and I get really infuriated because my question never fits in with what the chatbot can actually do. And so I end up spending 15 minutes getting annoyed at the chatbot only to get a human eventually anyway. So my answer is, well, why have the chatbot when a human could sort out actually much quicker than the chatbot could?
Yeah.
If you have speech translation, there are cases where it's fine. If you have a standard thing for your electric company and you just want to know how much is my next payment, a chatbot's great. If you have some complicated account issue, you need a person.
Yeah. Absolutely. Okay. Jonathan, another question I had was, I was thinking about, in preparation for this conversation, I was thinking about this and I thought, but today in the end, and I'm sure there are some people who also tell you, I guess,
Mm.
everyone speaks English in the world, right? So why do we really need to worry about translation and interpreting? What would you say to that?
I would say to that, I've got a lovely 5-minute video on YouTube about that, but it boils down to two things. One, no, not everyone speaks English. There
Hmm.
are lots of markets where people either don't speak English, or where for important cultural reasons, even if they do, they would rather that you didn't.
Hmm.
And then there's the idea, and we've known this from neuropsychology and neurolinguistics for a long while, that if you speak to someone in a language they learned later, that's processed differently to a language that they learned growing up.
Hmm.
And so if you want to persuade someone, if you want to trigger someone's emotions, if you want to sell to someone, you use their language.
Hmm.
There was a survey by an organization called Common Sense Advisory that pointed out, I think it's around 60% of second language English speakers refuse to buy in English.
Hmm.
Even if they're perfectly competent in it, they want to buy in their own language.
Really?
Yes. And so there's a very famous quote from, I think it's Willy Brandt, a politician, who said, if I'm selling to you, I'm going to speak in your language.
Hmm.
If you're selling to me, you better speak mine. And he actually changed language halfway through into German to make the point.
Hmm.
And
That's
also, yeah.
interesting. Sorry to cut you off, and I will go back.
Yeah.
That's interesting because, for example, for me, my own experience, and this is not about buying stuff, but so I've been living here in the UK for 7 years, and before London, I was somewhere else, also English speaking, and then Ireland. So it's been a while, and every time I need to do something online, now I'm Italian, but I prefer to do it in English. I don't know why. So it's interesting what you said. That in reality, for most people, it's the opposite.
It's a trust and it's a caring question.
Mm.
I ask people the question, when people say everyone speaks English, I say, okay, imagine that you spoke a second language and a company showed that their view of you was such that they didn't care enough to put stuff in your language.
Mm.
That not only says something about your value to them, it says something about their values.
Mm.
And so I've seen, and I've been to events where even though technically no one needed interpreters in inverted commas, interpreters were provided because the organization wanted to show the world, who in some cases was watching, we care enough to have interpreters. We're not going to say, well, they can get by. We're going to say, we are an international organization, therefore we will have interpreters. Sometimes it's it's a political with a small p decision.
Mm.
And also it could be a brand decision. Are you an international brand where why are you still in English all the time?
And sorry I cut you off before. I don't know whether you wanted to add something else in terms of, are there any other reasons why your audience should hear you in their own language? Did you want to add anything else?
Well, just one more, and that is speed of processing. So you will always process quicker in the language there are occasions where you wouldn't. So if you've been abroad for a long time and your first language has dropped down, but generally speaking, the language that people have used since they were small and that they're using every day is the language they process quicker in. And so I was, a very, very simple example, I was at an event once, and funnily enough, it was two groups of Italians. The first group of Italians, they were talking about something technical in the construction industry, and they felt the best thing to do for their prestige was to do their presentation in English. The problem was their English wasn't as good as they thought it was. And so you had 20 minutes of people kind of staring at their phones and staring out the window and kind of praying for coffee break. So after coffee break, the next group of Italians thought, we're not having that, because they'd spent, people had spent thousands of pounds to be there. So this group of Italians spoke in their best, I don't know if you have like artful Italian, but their best kind of really artful, really meaningful, really technically perfect Italian. My Italian colleagues then turned that into some of the best English that I've ever heard coming out of an interpreting booth, and we turned that into the other languages. Their speech went down so well that after 20 minutes, they got a standing ovation from the audience, and you couldn't get to their stand afterwards. And it's the same if you're an English speaker. Would you rather have people staring at their phones, or would you rather trust a team of expert interpreters to get you a standing ovation?
Of course. Okay. And talking about language, I saw a video of yours, I think on YouTube, where you talk about this idea that and this is not necessarily about public speaking, but I think it's very much connected. You say that you need, when you speak to a client or a potential client, you need to speak, do you say in English clientese?
Yeah, I coined the term clientese. It's probably someone else's term as well.
Okay, clientese. So you need to speak clientese, which means you need to speak the language of your clients. And the way I interpreted that was that, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that we are not just talking about the actual language, so Italian or French or English, but you need to meet them where they are in terms of what they need and what their concerns are. So would you like to explore their idea in a little bit more detail? And also, do you think there is a connection then with public speaking? Because I guess then in the end, when we speak to an audience, we also need to speak their language, not just in terms of the actual language, but in terms of what they need, what they want. Would you like to explore that?
That came off of a very painful experience where I was desperate to write for a client magazine, a leading one, and I sent them a pitch, and I'm used to pitching for magazines. It's something I do quite a lot to try and get business. And the email came back to say, sorry, that's not in our remit, which I was disappointed and surprised, but okay, fine. And I had pitched them an article on organising multilingual events. And they said that wasn't in their remit. But in the same week that they said to me that wasn't in their remit, they published an article on organising international events, which covered almost the same topic, except it didn't mention interpreting. And I realised then that what I said at the start of the podcast on you listen before you speak, I realised I had to do that. And so it's not just about finding out their needs and, finding what they care about. It's finding the phrases, the jargon, the terms that they use to describe their problems and their solutions. And so as interpreters, we sometimes have a bad habit of talking about source languages, target languages, booth regimes, and clients go, booth regime? What is this, kind of like North Korea or something? But we know what that means. But when we're speaking to the people that we want to buy our services, we need to talk in their terms. We need to talk about return on investment. We need to talk about efficiency. We need to talk about investment, costings and investment, and all of these things that they understand. And so whenever you're doing a speech, it's really important that you spend that time to go, okay, I want to talk about how to get the best interpreting possible. Well, actually, the people that I'm speaking to don't even know how to spell the word interpreting. They've probably never heard of it. They don't know the difference between interpreting and translation. What can I do to speak in their terms in a way that they understand? And that's when it's not just the classic marketing thing of what are their pain points. It's how are they speaking about their pain points and what would they call them? Yeah. And then that takes your talk from being, oh, this is interesting, to some of the best compliments that you can get as a speaker is when someone comes up to you afterwards and say, when did you read my diary? Talking exactly about the thing that I've been worrying about. That's when you know you've done your job.
Yeah, it takes us to another level. Absolutely. Yep. Okay, Jonathan, going back to what we were talking about before, again, speaking the language of the audience, are there any, and again, if it doesn't lead anywhere, we can rephrase or change the question, but are there any maybe techniques or tips or something relatively easy that a speaker could do when speaking to an audience who don't speak his or her own language? Anything that comes to your mind?
Apart from treating the interpreter as a partner, and if you think through what that looks like about briefing and talking to them beforehand, and apart from that, so that there are some really fundamental things that speakers can do. One is to watch your speed. Don't speak too quickly. don't speak too slowly. A good model is if you watch the BBC News, their speed is about the speed that is perfect for interpreting. So that's, for English, that is about the perfect speed. And it seems to work well enough for other languages as well. The other thing is to understand that you need to be able to boil your speech down to a single sentence so that you have the option, if you can see something isn't working, to switch things around. It's fine giving the interpreter your notes, and they need your notes, and they need your PowerPoint slides, but if you can see that that's not quite landing, then you need to know your key messages enough that they're going to, that you can move slightly, you can kind of turn slightly. That's super important, because there are going to be times when you're speaking to an audience that doesn't speak your language, that you say something and you go, I think I need to clarify that. If your speech is written out on a piece of paper, you can't do it. And I would say, especially when you're speaking to an audience who speak a different language, never, ever, ever read off a script. Work from notes, face the audience. You know, all of this is kind of basic public speaking stuff. But I would say if you're working with an interpreter, do the basics exceptionally well and know your speech well enough that you can make small changes if you need to.
And what happens to because based on my experience, I help mainly business professionals improve their presentations, and I know that you have some people for whom the very idea of getting up in front of an audience without knowing exactly what to say and when makes them feel very stressed. So they need to have a script and they want to read it word for word. And then you have other types of speakers. So to those, let's call them the learners. So what would you say then if you said that now actually when it comes, especially when you're talking to an audience who speak a different language, there might be an issue?
So the first thing that I would encourage them to think about is put yourself in the shoes of your audience. How does it feel if someone stands in front of you, gives you no eye contact and just looks at a script? It feels awful. We know how badly that feels, and actually it's better to have someone who stumbles slightly without a script but is human than to have someone who gets everything perfect but isn't even aware that any human being is there. But the main thing that I say to people, and often people who do that are doing it because they're nervous or because they're unsure, is if you've been asked to do the speech, it's because you know something this audience need to know. I would then say, throw away everything in your script and just get back to this one line that if the fire alarm goes off and people need to go out the room straight away and you've only got time for one line, what's that going to be? Once you've got that, you can rehearse your speech around that one single line. And the more you rehearse, the more it becomes natural, the more you can twist and turn that as you want because you know what's coming next. My speaking changed very, very quickly when I started working with coaches and friends who would get me to boil things down to what do people really need to know? Everything else is extra.
Yeah, no, I like that. To really make it simple and effective and simple for the audience to understand and remember what you say. Yeah.
I had a speaking coach once who challenged us all. We were preparing for an internal conference at the university, and he said, I want you to get to the point where if the computer with your slides breaks down and your speech notes fly away in the wind somehow, that you could still do the speech and no one would even know any different.
Yeah.
That's hard to get to, and I'll be honest and say not every speech that I've done has got there, but I now know that's the destination. And certainly for anything under half an hour, there's no reason why you shouldn't get there. Yeah,
of course. It takes preparation, but absolutely. If you want to do anything great, it's not just with public speaking, but with anything, then you need to be prepared.
And it is the great thing is that I was saying to someone, the more I rehearse, the more flexible I become, because I know in my head, okay, I've just said X. I need to get to Y. How I get there, I'll get there at some point.
Yeah, and going back to maybe some tips and tricks for speakers, I saw a great speaker. I know he's from London, a great entrepreneur, great speaker, and I noticed something which I appreciated a lot, and it's something very, very simple. He was speaking in Italy, in Milan. He speaks English as first language, and of course he can't speak Italian. But what he did, at least, his slides were written with, not with too much text, because we know it doesn't work, but in Italian.
Yeah.
And I said, you see, it's something very, very simple, but it's what you said before. What do you think if a company doesn't have your language when they communicate to you as an option? It tells you something about their values and what they care. And their example I saw told me something about the speaker, because he took the time to translate, even if it's just a few words on his slides for the audience.
And this is where, I mean, I used to be a translator, so translators work with written language, interpreters work with spoken or signed language. And I used to be a translator, and so now I'm aware of what translators need. And the ultimate best level of service that anyone can ever give at a conference is where you've got professional translators translating all the paperwork and the brochures and the slides, and professional interpreters doing the interpreting, and you've got someone getting them to work together. Because translators will happily spend a day getting the terminology absolutely perfect. Well, if they've done all that research, they might as well then pass it to the interpreting team, who will suddenly deliver perfect terminology. And then that's some of the research on clientese done, because a translator sat there and gone, I need to get this clientese for this presentation. That kind of strong working together is all too rare, but when it works, it really works, and it makes such a difference. And it's little things like, I've heard of speakers kind of go up to the interpreters before and say, how do I say thank you for inviting me in their language? Really simple stuff. You know, can you say hello in their language, even with a bit of a dodgy accent? You've tried. Can you say thank you in their language? You know, thank you in most languages is really, really easy to learn. Start your speech by saying thank you in their language. If there's only one other language there, great. If there's several, learn thank you in a few languages. That little thing that says, I care about you enough, that you're not just another client, not just another audience, that makes a difference. The best speech that I've ever interpreted was a Palestinian film director who had no notes, theatre director, he had no notes, but he looked everyone in the eye, he came down off the stage, he walked as close to the audience as the sound team would let him, and he connected. And we had all of these other technically brilliant speakers, and it was a cultural summit, so you can imagine the kind of people who were there. But this Palestinian film director did better than anyone else in the entire conference, because people knew that he cared.
And talking about caring, another example, and this is not related to language, but it might be interesting and useful for our listeners. I don't know if you know Guy Kawasaki, great speaker, and what he does, or at least what he used to do, when he speaks at international events, say for example he goes from the US to Russia for a talk, and then he likes to spend at least a few hours, or maybe the day before, visiting the city a little bit, taking photos. And then he starts the talk just by showing his own photos from the day before, and that for exactly the same reason. It's not about the language, but to establish a first connection with the audience.
And even, I mean, every city has its own jokes, and every country has its own jokes. And, you know, if someone comes to Edinburgh and makes a joke about the weather, it sounds funnier for some reason. My running joke is that I could do the opening speech of any conference that ever happens in Edinburgh, because they always include haggis, rain, and kilts. But if you can, you know, I've seen speakers, and some speakers can't get away with it, but, you know, speakers who come to Scotland and hire a kilt just for their talk, do it right, and that actually really comes off well. Yeah, and it's showing that you care, showing that the audience matter. And I love it. I really appreciate it when speakers will come up to the interpreters at some point and just say hi. We're beyond the stage where interpreters would kind of run away and hide just in case someone got them to work at lunch break. But, you know, to come up to the interpreters and say, you know, hi, how are you? Is there anything else you need? Are you all prepped? If there's a big team, go up to the consultant and get the consultant to show you around everyone. That really, really makes a difference. Especially when there are some cases where things just don't go well, and for someone to come up and say, "Oh, look, I'm really sorry," that makes a difference.
And,
Yeah.
and actually, I'm curious now. Maybe you mentioned it before, but I missed it. Technically, how does it work normally? So you as an interpreter, for example, are you on stage with the speaker, or on the side, or be behind the stage? How does it work?
So it depends. There are three main what we call interpreting modes. It's just ways of running interpreting. So there's on stage with the speaker, which means that you have to alternate roughly a sentence or so at a time. So I would say to people, if they know that's going to happen, definitely contact the interpreter before. Drop me an email or something, because there are specific techniques that you need to know to do that well. Otherwise, it's really boring, and your speech is going to be about twice as long. So that one happens. Then you have what's called long consecutive, which is usually used for after dinner speeches. So if you're speaking for about, say, 10 minutes, they might just get you to do the entire speech, and then the interpreter will be taking special notes and will give the same speech afterwards in the other language, usually about 20 to 30% shorter. The most common one that most people will see, however, is what's called simultaneous, where speakers on stage and you get two interpreters per language in a soundproof booth at the back, hopefully being able to see the speaker. Not everywhere is as well planned. And that means that they're physically separate from you, but they're hearing you direct into your ears using a headset like the one I'm wearing right now, just over one ear rather than two. And they will be a couple of seconds behind. So if you're getting people to raise their hands, you have to wait a few seconds after you say, please raise your hands, because there will be a 2 to 3 second delay.
I said, raise your hands.
Well, there have been occasions where people have been taking a vote in a meeting. There's a story of, the old lady who always votes the same way, and suddenly they need interpreters and she ends up voting the other way because the chair didn't wait long enough. That happens. There are now cases where people are doing webinars or some conferences where the interpreters could be in a completely different city. But basically there you just use the same guidelines as for simultaneous interpreting. You just prep as you would before, somehow try to get contact before, and it will run mostly the same. But if there's an interpreter present with you, it will be on stage, long consec, or sim in a booth 99 times out of 100. And so that's when it really helps to speak to the interpreter, understand what they're doing. And even, it's nice for some speakers to say, can I come and see the booth? Because it's nice for us to show where we work for 7.5 hours a day.
Gotcha.
And then they see how little space we have for notes sometimes.
And Jonathan, I also read, and I'm reading here a piece from you where you say something interesting, and I'd like you to explore the idea in a bit more detail. And correct me if I'm using incorrect words, but I think you wrote somewhere that public speaking is not about transferring information, it's about making memories.
So that was a public speaking course that I did. I believe that one was in Prague. And what most people misunderstand public speaking and think that it's about kind of taking a brain dump on the audience. Here's everything I know, blop. Now, the problem with that is that if you ask people 5 minutes later, what did the speaker talk about? They go, I have no idea. On the other hand, if people need to do something with their speech, so if they need to change their business, or if they're going to have a new fitness regime, or whatever change you're asking people to make with your speech, they can't make that change if they can't remember what you said. And most people will remember something that happened more than what was said. So then I borrowed actually that idea from a music producer called Tom Jackson, who works with live bands, and says that a concert is not about the music, it's about the memories. True. And I realized the parallels between what he was saying is, he says, if you get a band that just stands on stage and plays beautifully well on the instruments, but it's just someone's strumming a guitar, no one will ever want to come back. It's the same with a speaker. If they just stand and say stuff, they've said stuff, big deal. If there's something that they've done or said or made people feel that lodges in people's brains, then actually they've done a whole lot more. So at the end of that one where I talked about, public speaking is about making memories, I wanted people to see how creative they could be. And so I borrowed an exercise from a man called Brian Clemmer and got them to find as many different ways as they could just to cross the room. As people do public speaking and think, I'm not creative, I can't do all of this theatrical stuff, I can't do intonation, I can't do props. You get them to cross a room. As many, get the audience to say, okay, whatever method the person ahead of you uses, you can't use. You need to use something that no one's seen before.
What's that? I'm curious.
So we had two people ballroom dancing, we had hopping, we had skipping, we had running, we had walking backwards, we had crawling, all these different methods. And you could do any simple task and say, find as many ways to do it as you can. And then I said to people, what really makes a great speech stand out is when people can see the creativity in it somehow. Has there been an emotional effect? Has there been a prop? Has there been some something that's lodged in people's brain? A memory is just a fact with an emotion attached. That's Dr. Caroline Leaf, a neuropsychologist. Memory is just a fact with an emotion attached. So if you're speaking, make memories using some kind of emotion. Is that going to be a crazy prop? Is that going to be hiding in the wings? Whatever it is, find something that talks about your main point and lodges it in people's brains in a way that they're not going to forget when they go to coffee.
Yeah. Jonathan, shall we spend a few minutes before we wrap up just for a couple of questions, which would be mainly relevant for international event organizers, because you have experience there. One question is that I think I heard you say that you think that even international events organizers, they should stop running English-only events. Now, we've talked about the fact that not everybody speaks English. Are there any other reasons why that's the case from your perspective?
Well, everyone at the moment in the events industry is talking about diversity. And I heard someone from a major events software company, I can't remember who, otherwise I would cite him because I like to cite people, point out that he said that we have every kind of diversity, but we don't often have racial or linguistic diversity. And he said that his company are now stopping running English-only events because they realized that by having them all in English, they were giving privilege and prestige to a small group of people in the company and closing themselves off to everyone else's ideas. So I would say to event managers, even if the client brief doesn't specifically say it, explain to them why, especially if they're after diversity, especially if they're after attracting an international audience, having an English only basically says you only care about this small segment. It's part of our commitment to diversity, it's part of our commitment to acceptance, it's part of our commitment to, the other thing that's going around at the moment is, events aren't events anymore, they're experiences. Well, what does an experience feel like if you're spending all day in your second, third, fourth, fifth language? Come on, use a tiny bit of common sense and think, we want this experience to work for everyone. That is going to look like we're an international event, we're international enough to have other languages.
Yeah. And say, for example, an international events organizer gets it and he or she says, yeah, I'd like to cooperate and work together with an interpreting team. What do they need to know? What do they need to consider? And also particularly, how many interpreters do they need? Of course, I guess it depends on the event, but would you like to explain that?
So if they're running with simultaneous interpreting or really anything longer than a single 10-minute speech, the rule of thumb is 2 interpreters per language. So if you've got speakers speaking in English and they're going into French, German and Dutch, you need 6 interpreters. Because any more than half an hour, especially of simultaneous interpreting, and your brain begins to go funny. So you just, for quality reasons and for everyone's sanity, you really need 2 interpreters per language. There are occasional minor exceptions. So if you've got interpreters doing French, German and Italian, say, you won't need separate interpreters to go French to German because we have ways of dealing with that. If they're doing simultaneous interpreting, it's really important that they either get a consultant interpreter in, who's an interpreter trained to and knows all about the sound equipment and the technical side of things as well, and also knows how to work with them to get it right, or to get an agency that's registered with a professional association. There are a lot of agencies who say they're interpreting agencies but don't have a clue. So in the UK, I would say to them that they really should lean on the agencies that are members of the Institute of Translation and Interpreting.
Mm.
And if it's a one-off event with a lot of languages, an agency's okay. If it's anything to do with long-term partnership, I would really say to them, please get a consultant or build your own team. Or both, because there's a different relationship that happens, and also our consultant will send you the same people all the time. For simultaneous interpreting, you need booths, you need headsets, you need to make sure the whole place is mic'd up properly. But the people who supply the interpreting equipment know that already, and you don't need to say to them, we need all of these pieces. You need to say, we need these languages, and your consultant and your AV team will go, right, we'll make that work for you.
Yeah.
A lot of it is trust, and a lot of it is partnership. But yeah, so 2 interpreters per language. Get a good AV team and a good consultant, or get the consultant to get you a good AV team. And I would also say, be very, very wary of any supplier who can give you an instant quote. If they can tell you in 5 minutes how much it's going to cost, they haven't thought it through properly.
It's not customized and it's standard, I guess.
Yeah, so they'll just throw the same standard package at you, and you go, I would say, when I'm building a team from scratch, I would say like 48, 72 hours is about the right time scale, depending on what they're asking for. I was once asked, can you find 20 specialist medical conference interpreters to cover 10 different languages? And I said, yes, but you'll need to give me about 5 days.
Yeah.
And it took a little bit more than that, actually, because they were asking, I have lots of contacts and I have ways of dealing with things, but that was like the biggest ask I've had. But, if someone says to me, can I get interpreters for French? Yeah, it's a 24-hour job. Yeah. But if someone says, yeah, here's 2 French interpreters and here's a quote in 5 minutes, I would be very, very, very suspicious.
Yeah. Jonathan, thank you very much. For me, it's been fun. I've learned a lot because, especially for me, of course, we are I would say, in a similar space, not at all the same, but at the same time, because we're talking about public speaking ultimately, but from very different angles. So for me, it's been great. It's been fun. Before we wrap up, would you like to add anything else? Is there anything that you would like me to ask you and I haven't done it? Anything you'd like to add before we close?
I think I'd just like to leave everyone listening to this with this simple idea, that what we often look at as a challenge or a difficulty, this kind of idea of a language barrier, imagine linguistic difference not as a barrier, but as an opportunity. Interpreters aren't there because you need them. They're there because they multiply your impact. They multiply the audience that you can reach. When we start seeing linguistic difference as an opportunity or a trampoline to something even greater and better, our attitude shifts to the extent that we become better speakers, because then we see our audiences in a whole new light. So I would encourage everyone listening to this to banish from your mind forever this idea of language barriers and see them as language opportunities.
And I love that. I think this is the best place to end our conversation, talking about opportunities instead of barriers. Thank you very much again, Jonathan. It's been fun. I enjoyed it a lot. I've learned a lot. I'm sure it's been the same for our listeners. And I wish you all the best with your current and future projects.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Ideas on Stage podcast, there are many more you might like, so please subscribe, leave us a review, and tell us what you think. You can find many more ideas on business communication at ideasonstage.com or by searching for Ideas on Stage on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and goodbye for now.